The cold hospital floor felt like ice against my cheek, and I could taste blood, copper and salt mixing with that sterile antiseptic smell that never quite leaves these places. My surgical incision screamed as I tried to push myself up, white-hot pain tearing through my abdomen. Nurses' shoes squeaked against the polished tiles as they rushed toward me, their voices blurring into a distant hum. 3 days. I'd been out of emergency surgery for just 3 days when my stepfather decided I was faking being weak. I'm Rihanna Hester, 29 years old, and until that moment, lying on that hospital floor with an IV stand toppled beside me and blood on my gown, I thought I understood what rock bottom looked like. I was wrong. The morning had started like any other in room 304. I was propped up in bed, still groggy from pain meds, when Gary stormed in without knocking. My stepfather of 3 years filled the doorway like he owned the place, which, honestly, was how he acted everywhere. The appendectomy had been emergency surgery, the kind where the surgeon pulls you aside afterward and says, "Another 2 hours and this would have been a very different conversation." They'd caught it just in time. Lucky me. Gary had been complaining about the hospital bills before I was even fully awake from anesthesia. My mother sat in her usual corner chair, folded into herself the way she'd learned to do since marrying him. She'd developed this remarkable ability to disappear while remaining physically present, shrinking smaller and smaller until she was barely visible, just a shadow in the floral print dress she'd worn to please him. That morning, Gary had worked himself into one of his special rages. His face darkened to that particular shade of purple I'd come to recognize, the color of beets. Nobody actually likes, but everyone pretends to eat because they're supposed to be good for you. He paced the small room, gesturing wildly as he ranted about how I needed to start earning my keep, how his hard-earned money wasn't going to support a freeloader. Never mind that I'd been working 2 jobs before my appendix decided to rupture. Never mind that I'd been paying rent to live in my childhood home ever since Gary moved in and declared himself king of the castle. Never mind the doctor's orders, 2 weeks minimum recovery before any work. You think money grows on trees? His voice bounced off the sterile walls. You think I'm made of money? That surgery cost more than your mother's car, and I'm supposed to just eat that? I tried to explain, again, that I had insurance, that I'd make payments, that the doctor said. That's when it happened. The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming. 1 second I was propped up in bed. The next, I was on the floor, my IV ripped from my arm, the stand crashing down beside me. The heart monitor started shrieking its electronic panic. My hands shook as I tried to push myself up, and that's when I tasted it, copper, warm and wet, spreading from my split lip. Gary stood over me. His bowling league championship ring, the one he'd won in 2019 and never stopped mentioning, glinting on his hand, the hand that had just hit me. He was still yelling, something about how I needed to stop pretending, stop being dramatic, stop costing him money. The irony that he was creating the most dramatic scene in that hospital wing didn't seem to occur to him. By the time 2 nurses, a security guard, and 3 police officers rushed in, Gary's face had gone from purple rage to something else entirely, white shock, panic, the expression of a man who'd just realized he'd miscalculated badly. He started explaining immediately how this was all a misunderstanding, how he was just trying to give me some tough love, how kids these days, he called me a kid even though I'm pushing 30, needed discipline. The words tumbled out of him like coins from a broken slot machine. Officer Martinez wasn't buying it. She took 1 look at me on the floor, blood on my hospital gown, nurses frantically checking my incision, and her jaw set in a way that told me someone was about to have a very bad day. For once, it wasn't going to be me. Mrs. Chen, my 83-year-old roommate recovering from hip surgery, had been pressing her call button repeatedly, demanding to give a witness statement. She'd survived the Cultural Revolution in China, she told the officers in her accented English. And she wasn't about to stay quiet while some bowling league reject terrorized a young woman. Gary flinched at that. That league was his entire identity outside of making our lives miserable. My mother finally found her voice, but only to defend him. He's just stressed about the bills, she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't mean it. He's a good man. Really. The words came out of her mouth, but her eyes told a different story. There was something there, fear, maybe. Or just complete exhaustion from 3 years of walking on eggshells. She'd aged a decade since marrying Gary, not gracefully, either. This was the kind of aging that comes from constant worry, from never knowing what mood would walk through the door each evening. The police made Gary leave the hospital, but they couldn't make him leave our lives. Not yet. He was back home before I was even discharged, acting like nothing had happened. My mother picked me up alone, making excuses about how Gary had to work. But we both knew he was probably at home polishing his Corvette and telling himself he was the victim in all this. Let me back up and explain how we got here. Because nobody starts out living with someone who thinks it's acceptable to slap you around in a hospital. Gary entered our lives like most predators do, dressed up as salvation. 3 years ago, my mother was drowning in debt from my father's medical bills. Dad had fought cancer for 2 years before it won, and even with insurance, the bills were astronomical. I was working retail and freelance graphic design, contributing what I could, but it felt like trying to bail out the Titanic with a teaspoon. Then Gary appeared at my mother's book club, of all places, someone's plus one. He claimed to be a successful businessman who'd just moved to town for the small town charm. He drove that Corvette, wore expensive-looking clothes, I later learned they were knockoffs from outlet malls, and seemed to have solutions to all our problems. The courtship was whirlwind, 6 months from meeting to marriage. He promised to take care of everything, to be the man of the house. Looking back, the red flags were everywhere, but when you're desperate, you become colorblind. He moved in immediately after the wedding, and that's when the real Gary started showing up. First, little things. He needed to be added to my mother's bank accounts to help manage the finances. Then he convinced her to put him on the house deed for tax purposes. He said, "My disability payments from a car accident 5 years ago? Those needed to go into the household account he controlled for budgeting purposes." I was working 2 jobs despite my chronic pain, but somehow we were always broke, always behind, always needing to tighten our belts while Gary's Corvette never missed an oil change. I started noticing things going missing, not valuable things. Gary was smarter than that, but paperwork would disappear. Medical bills would vanish before I could review them. Insurance documents would get mysteriously lost in the mail. When I'd ask about them, Gary would pat me on the head like I was a confused child and tell me he was handling everything, that I shouldn't worry my pretty little head about it. The condescension dripped off his words like syrup, sickly sweet and just as fake. Mrs. Chen from next door, not the same Mrs. Chen from the hospital. This one was Vietnamese and made the best spring rolls in the county, tried to warn us. She'd seen Gary screaming at my mother in the backyard. Seen him punch the wall so hard he left a hole that he made me patch up and paint over. But she was scared, too. Gary had a way of letting people know he knew things about them, where they worked, where their kids went to school, what time they walked their dogs. Nothing explicitly threatening, just enough to make everyone uncomfortable. The pattern became clearer after my surgery. While I was lying in that hospital bed, I had time to think, to piece things together. Gary's rage about money wasn't random, it was calculated. Every time I got close to figuring out our finances, there'd be a crisis. Every time my mother started asking questions, she'd suddenly get sick with mysterious stomach problems that kept her bedridden and dependent. Every time I saved enough money to potentially move out, there'd be an emergency that drained my savings. The nurse who discharged me, Rebecca, slipped something into my paperwork when Gary wasn't looking. A small card for a domestic violence hotline, hidden between wound care instructions and prescription information. She didn't say anything, just squeezed my hand and gave me a look that said she'd seen this before too many times. Late at night, when Gary was at his bowling league and my mother was asleep, I started reading. The patterns described on that website were like reading my own diary, if I'd been honest enough to keep one. 2 weeks into my recovery, Gary made what would turn out to be his biggest mistake. He went to a bowling tournament in Atlantic City, a 3-day event he'd been talking about for months. He'd even taken money from my mother's emergency fund to cover his entry fees and hotel, claiming he'd win it all back and then some. My mother was having one of her bad days, curled up in bed with another mysterious illness, so I had the run of the house. I'd always wondered why Gary's home office was locked. He claimed it was for important business documents, but for someone who was supposedly such a successful businessman, he sure spent a lot of time at home watching TV and yelling at cable news. Maybe it was the pain medication making me bolder, Or maybe I'd just finally had enough. But I decided to pick that lock. YouTube University taught me everything I needed to know. And it turned out those fancy locks Gary installed were actually pretty cheap, just like everything else about him that seemed impressive at first glance. What I found in that office changed everything. First, the marriage certificates, plural. Gary had been married 4 times before my mother, not the twice he'd mentioned. Each marriage had lasted between 2 and 4 years. Each had ended with restraining orders. I found the actual documents. Barbara from Ohio, Darlene from Pennsylvania, Susan from New Jersey, and Margaret from Delaware. There was a pattern to the locations, always moving at least one state away after each divorce, probably to avoid anyone comparing notes. But that wasn't even the worst part. I found paperwork showing Gary had been collecting disability benefits in my name, using my social security number. He'd been filing claims I knew nothing about, pocketing the money while telling me my benefits had been reduced. There were credit cards in my name I'd never applied for, loans I'd never taken out. My credit score, which I'd been carefully rebuilding after some stupid decisions in my early 20s, was destroyed. And then I found the life insurance policies, 3 of them on my mother, all taken out in the last year, all with Gary as the sole beneficiary. The total payout if something happened to her? $2 million. For a woman who'd been healthy as a horse before Gary came along. She'd sure been sick a lot lately. Those vitamins he insisted she take every day, the special ones he ordered online because store-bought ones weren't good enough. I photographed every bottle, every label. The real jackpot was Gary's laptop, left open and logged in. His email was a treasure trove. Conversations with women on dating sites where he was still active, still trolling for new victims. His profile claimed he was a widower. My mother wasn't dead yet. But apparently Gary was planning ahead. He described himself as a successful entrepreneur with no kids, looking for a traditional woman who knows how to appreciate a real man. I threw up a little reading that, and not just from the post-surgery nausea. There were emails to a lawyer about selling our house, my mother's house, the one my father had paid off with his life insurance so we'd always have a home. Gary was asking about power of attorney, about what would happen if my mother became mentally incompetent. And then there were the browser searches, undetectable poisons, inducing heart attacks, making deaths look natural. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold my phone steady to photograph everything. I knew I couldn't do this alone. Gary had isolated us pretty effectively. My mother's friends rarely came around anymore. Family members pushed away by his rude behavior at gatherings. But I had those names now, those ex-wives. And in 2024, everyone leaves digital footprints. I found Darlene first, on Facebook. Her profile was locked down tight, but her profile picture showed her smiling, holding a sign that said, "Survived and thriving." I sent her a message with just Gary's name and a photo of him. Within an hour, she'd responded with 3 words that told me everything. He got another? Our first phone call lasted 3 hours. Darlene's story was eerily familiar. The whirlwind romance, the financial control, the mysterious illnesses, the isolation. She'd gotten out when she caught him putting something in her coffee. She couldn't prove it was poison, but she knew. The divorce had been brutal. Gary had tried to claim she was crazy, but she'd had enough documentation to get a restraining order and keep her house, barely. Darlene had stayed in touch with Barbara and Margaret. Susan had passed away, officially a heart attack, but Darlene had her doubts. Within a week, we had a group chat going, sharing evidence, comparing timelines. The patterns were undeniable. Gary even used the same lines on all of us, the same tactics, the same escalation timeline. We started calling ourselves the Gary Survivors Club, which sounds funnier than it felt at the time. Margaret, a paralegal, started helping me understand what kind of evidence would hold up in court. Barbara, who'd become an advocate for domestic violence survivors, knew all the resources, all the right people to call. Darlene, who'd kept everything from her marriage, every receipt, every email, every text, had evidence that showed this was a pattern going back 15 years. Meanwhile, I had to keep playing the part at home. I had to pretend to still be weak from surgery, had to let Gary believe he was in complete control. It was the hardest acting job of my life, especially when he'd make comments about how my mother was getting sicker, how maybe we should start thinking about assisted living facilities. How he'd take care of everything when she was gone. The way he said, when, not if, made my skin crawl. Mrs. Chen next door had noticed my mother's decline, too. Her daughter Amy was a pharmacist, and when I showed her pictures of the vitamins, her face went pale. She couldn't legally tell me what she thought they were without seeing the actual bottles, but she did say that several of the supplements Gary was giving my mother could cause exactly the symptoms she was experiencing, and that taken long-term, they could cause organ failure. We needed more proof, and we needed it fast. My mother was getting weaker every day, and Gary was getting bolder. He'd started talking about a cruise he wanted to take with her, just the two of them, somewhere international, where, as he put it, anything could happen. The way he said it made everyone in our survivor group chat agree. We had to act before that cruise. If you're still with me, I want you to know how much your support means. Please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because this story isn't over yet, not by a long shot. The cameras caught everything. I'd turned our home into a surveillance state, and Gary never suspected a thing. Tiny lenses hidden in phone chargers, smoke detectors, even a digital clock in their bedroom. Every room watched, every moment recorded. What I captured would have been darkly comedic if it wasn't so terrifying. Gary, alone, practiced conversations in front of the bathroom mirror. He'd rehearse what he'd tell police when Mom died, the right amount of grief in his voice, the kia dao how chu de pause, the quivering lip. He actually practiced crying, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief like some community theater reject auditioning for a soap opera. He'd count stacks of imaginary money, making plans for after his tragic loss. He even rehearsed updates for his dating profiles, timing them for an appropriate mourning period, which, according to his calculations, would be approximately 3 weeks. The bowling league provided an unexpected break. Gary had been running a side hustle, borrowing money from teammates for a sure thing business investment. He'd convinced 6 men to hand over their retirement savings, promising to triple their money in 6 months. The paperwork he showed them was entirely fake. I know because I found the templates on his computer, right next to tutorials on forging financial documents and a search history that included best states for bigamy laws. Subtlety was not Gary's strong suit. 3 months after the hospital incident, Gary made his move. He came home from bowling league one Tuesday night with papers, legal documents that would grant him power of attorney over Mom's medical and financial decisions. Just a formality, he claimed. Something the lawyer recommended since Mom had been so sick lately. The timing wasn't coincidental. Mom had been particularly ill that week after Gary increased her vitamin doses, citing flu season and the need for extra protection. I sat at the kitchen table, still playing my role, the weak, recovering stepdaughter who posed no threat. Gary pushed the papers toward me along with a pen that probably cost more than any birthday gift he'd ever bought Mom. He wanted me to witness her signature, said it would be better if family verified she was of sound mind. The irony of him caring about appearances of legitimacy while slowly poisoning her wasn't lost on me. Mom's hand shook as she reached for the pen. She looked at me with hollow eyes, like she knew something was wrong but couldn't quite grasp what. The vitamins Gary gave her, we'd figured out they contained high doses of supplements that could cause confusion and memory problems when combined, perfect for manufacturing mental incompetence. I wanted to scream, to flip the table, to take that expensive pen and shove it somewhere Gary would need surgery to retrieve. Instead, I did something better. I played along. Gary, I said, layering my voice with innocent confusion, shouldn't we have the lawyer here for something this important? I mean, just to make sure everything's legal and proper. You're always so careful about these things. His face did an interesting twitch, annoyance wrestling with the need to appear reasonable. He couldn't argue without seeming suspicious, so he agreed to schedule a proper signing for the following week. 7 days. We had 7 days to save Mom's life and put Gary exactly where he belonged. The ex-wives group chat exploded with activity. Darlene had found something crucial. Gary had pulled this exact power of attorney move with Margaret right before her accident, the one that left her hospitalized for weeks, making Gary her medical decision-maker. She'd only escaped because her sister flew in from Seattle and raised hell with hospital administration. Barbara remembered something similar, though in her case it had been about property transfer. We were mapping Gary's playbook. And it read like a serial killer's manual, except instead of murder, it was slow-motion financial and emotional assassination, with a side of poisoning. Then came the bowling league discovery that changed everything. Remember those teammates Gary had scammed? One of them, Big Eddie, all 300 pounds of him, had a nephew who worked in IT security. Tyler was one of those guys who could probably hack the Pentagon but chose to use his powers for good. When Big Eddie discovered his retirement money was gone, really gone, not invested in some magical startup, Tyler got involved. He dug deep and found that Gary had been running identical scams in every state he'd lived in. We're talking millions of dollars over 15 years, dozens of victims across state lines. But here's where it gets beautiful. Gary wasn't smart enough to hide his digital trail. He used the same passwords for everything, Gary Bowles 300. Because of course he did, the same email variations, the same fake business names. Tyler documented everything, creating a file so comprehensive it would make the FBI weep with joy at how easy their job was about to become. Meanwhile, at home, things escalated. Gary announced he'd booked that cruise, 2 weeks in the Caribbean, just him and Mom, leaving in 10 days. He'd already arranged for me to stay with an aunt I hadn't spoken to in years, claiming I needed family support while they were gone. The aunt, when I called her, had no idea what I was talking about. Gary had fabricated the entire arrangement, probably planning to claim I'd run away, or worse, while they were gone. The cameras kept capturing gold. Gary on the phone with someone, discussing how the situation would be resolved soon and how the insurance payout would make everything worthwhile. Gary grinding pills and mixing them into Mom's protein shakes, the ones he insisted she drink for strength. Gary practicing his grieving widower act with increasing elaboration. He'd even bought a black suit, which he modeled while rehearsing Mom's eulogy. The man was practicing her funeral while she slept in the next room. If it wasn't so horrifying, it would have been absurdly comedic, like a villain in a bad Lifetime movie. The night before Gary's scheduled power of attorney signing, we made our move. It had to be coordinated perfectly, the FBI for interstate fraud, Adult Protective Services for Mom, local police for assault and attempted murder, and the IRS, because guess who hadn't been paying taxes on all that stolen money? The bowling league provided the perfect opportunity. Thursday night was championship playoffs, and Gary wouldn't miss it for anything. He'd been practicing his hook release for weeks, boring anyone within earshot with details about pin carry and oil patterns. He left the house at 6:30, kissing Mom on the forehead in a gesture that would have seemed sweet if I hadn't watched him put something in her afternoon tea an hour earlier. At 7 p.m., our house transformed into something from a crime procedural. FBI agents, local police, social workers, and paramedics arrived simultaneously. Mom was confused but cooperative as they took her to the hospital for evaluation and treatment. The vitamins were seized for testing. The computers, the documents, everything in Gary's office was boxed as evidence. Mrs. Chen from next door stood on her lawn, openly filming everything on her phone while providing commentary in Vietnamese to what I assume was every relative she had back in Saigon. At the bowling alley, a different scene unfolded. The FBI agents waited until Gary was mid-frame. He'd just thrown what would have been a strike, his form perfect. That stupid championship ring glinting under the cosmic bowling lights. They let him finish the frame. Law enforcement can be petty too, and I deeply appreciated it. The entire league watched as Gary was read his rights, handcuffed, and walked past the shoe rental counter. Big Eddie started a slow clap that swelled into thunderous applause by the time they reached the door. But Gary's night wasn't over. Back at the house, they'd found enough evidence to add attempted murder to the charges. The vitamins tested positive for several substances that, when combined, could cause organ failure over time. The life insurance policies, forged documents, stolen disability benefits. It was a prosecutor's dream. Gary's laptop had been seized too, with all his research on untraceable poisons and making accidents look natural. For someone who thought he was so clever, Gary never understood that clearing browser history doesn't actually delete anything. Tyler, Big Eddie's nephew, had created a website, GaryScamAlert.com. Within hours of Gary's arrest, it went live with photos, documentation, and victim testimonials. The bowling league teammates weren't just angry about their money, they were furious about being made fools of. These were proud men who'd worked their whole lives, saved carefully, and Gary had played them like a fiddle. The website crashed 3 times that first night from traffic. Gary's arrest made the 11 o'clock news. The headline read, "Local man arrested in multi-state fraud and attempted murder scheme," which really didn't capture the full pathetic nature of his crimes. By morning, it had gone viral. Someone at the bowling alley had filmed the arrest, and the video of Gary trying to explain to FBI agents that this was all a misunderstanding while wearing those ridiculous bowling shoes became an instant meme. His workplace, oh yes. Gary actually did have a real job selling used cars at a dealership that advertised heavily during daytime TV, fired him via text message while he was still in custody. His boss later told reporters that Gary had been their worst salesperson anyway, spending most of his time running side schemes with customers' trade-ins. The dealership actually saw sales increase after firing Gary, with customers specifically saying they'd stayed away because of him. The dating sites were brutal. The Gary Survivors Club had made sure his profiles were updated with his mugshot and a helpful note about his arrest. Women who'd been talking to him started sharing their conversations online. One woman posted that he'd asked her for a loan on their second date to help with his sick mother's medical bills. His sick mother had been dead for 15 years. But the best part, the absolute chef's kiss of cosmic justice, was when Gary's Corvette got repossessed. Turns out he'd been months behind on payments, juggling credit cards to make minimum payments while telling everyone he owned it outright. The repo man showed up during a news interview Gary's court-appointed lawyer was trying to give on our front lawn. The look on the lawyer's face as the Corvette was loaded onto the flatbed in the background while he claimed his client was innocent? Priceless. The news anchor actually laughed on air. Mom's recovery was remarkable once she was off Gary's vitamins. Within a week, her color returned, her confusion lifted, and she was able to give a full statement to police. The doctor said another month on those supplements could have caused irreversible organ damage. She cried when she realized what Gary had been doing. But they weren't just tears of sadness, there was relief too. Relief that she wasn't going crazy, that her illness had been real but manufactured, that she wasn't losing her mind, she was being poisoned. The other victims started coming forward. Women from Delaware, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, they all had stories. The FBI created a dedicated tip line that received over 200 calls in the first week. Gary's pattern was so consistent it was almost boring. Find vulnerable women, marry or move in, take control of finances, slowly poison them while setting up life insurance, then cash out. The only reason more women weren't dead was that Gary usually got impatient and sloppy, leading to divorces instead of funerals. The bowling league formally banned Gary for life, which might seem minor compared to federal charges, but for Gary, it was devastating. His lawyer actually had to prevent him from calling the league president from jail to plead his case. The league went further. They created the Gary Rule, requiring financial background checks for anyone borrowing from the league's loan fund. Big Eddie got to announce it at the next tournament to a standing ovation. Local Facebook groups had a field day. Gary's mugshot became the profile picture for a group called Surviving Springfield's Worst, where people shared stories of his various scams over the years. The woman who ran the diner posted that he'd never tipped, always complained to get free food, and once tried to pay with a check from a closed account. The librarian shared that he'd stolen DVDs and tried to sell them at the pawn shop. Even his barber chimed in. Gary always tried to negotiate the price of a $15 haircut. The trial was almost anticlimactic after everything else. Gary's lawyer tried to argue mental incompetence, which was richly ironic considering how Gary had tried to have Mom declared incompetent. The prosecutor, a wonderful woman named Patricia who wore pearls and had a voice like honey over broken glass, systematically destroyed every defense. She had receipts, literally and figuratively. The evidence was so overwhelming that the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, and that included lunch. 15 years. That's what Gary got. 15 years for fraud, attempted murder, assault, identity theft, and a handful of other charges the judge rattled off like a grocery list. Gary tried to make a statement about being misunderstood, about how he'd only wanted to take care of his family, but the judge cut him off mid-sentence. "Mr. Peterson," she said, "the only thing you've taken care of is yourself, and you didn't even do that well." Mom got the house back free and clear, plus damages from the civil suit. The other victims received settlements too, though for some, money couldn't undo the damage to their health and trust. We used part of the settlement to completely redo the house, starting with Gary's office, which we turned into a craft room where Mom now makes quilts for the women's shelter. Every quilt is a small act of reclaiming her space and her life. I started working with a domestic violence advocacy group, sharing my story and helping other families recognize the signs of financial and medical abuse. It's amazing how many people think domestic violence is just about physical hitting. Gary hit me once, yes, but the real violence was the slow, deliberate destruction of our lives, the calculated cruelty of his schemes. The slap in the hospital was just the visible part of an iceberg of abuse. The Gary Survivors Club still meets, now expanded to include 12 women he'd targeted over the years. We have brunch once a month at a little place that serves bottomless mimosas and doesn't judge when Darlene gets a little loud after her third glass. We laugh now, really laugh, about things that seemed so scary at the time. How Gary claimed to be allergic to gluten but would sneak bread when he thought no one was looking. How he said he was a wine connoisseur but only bought the stuff from gas stations. How he practiced crying in the mirror like some kind of reptile trying to imitate human emotion. Mrs. Chen from next door has basically adopted us. She brings over spring rolls every Sunday and sits with Mom, teaching her to play mahjong while gossiping about the neighborhood. Her daughter Amy helped us understand exactly what Gary had been doing with those supplements and testified at the trial. The other Mrs. Chen, my hospital roommate, sent a card saying she was proud of me for standing up to that bowling ball-headed fool. 6 months after the trial, I was walking into my new job at the Victim Advocacy Center when I ran into Rebecca, the nurse who'd slipped me that domestic violence card at the hospital. She remembered me immediately, said she'd followed the case in the news. "I knew you were a fighter," she said. "Sometimes you can just tell." We hugged right there in the parking lot, two strangers who weren't really strangers anymore, connected by a moment of kindness when I needed it most. A small card, slipped into paperwork when no one was looking. That's all it took. That's all it ever takes sometimes, someone who sees you, who believes you, who gives you a tiny thread to hold onto when everything else is falling apart. I still have that card. It's taped to my computer monitor at work, a reminder of where I started and how far I've come. And every time I hand a similar card to someone else, someone sitting in my office with that hollow look I remember so well, I think about Rebecca, about how one small act of courage can ripple outward in ways you'll never know. The cold hospital tiles against my cheek feel like a lifetime ago. The taste of blood, the screaming machines, Gary standing over me with that stupid championship ring, it's all memory now, fading like bruises. But I carry it with me, the way survivors do, not as weight, but as fuel, as proof that even at rock bottom, even bleeding on a hospital floor with your stepfather yelling above you, there's still a way up. You just have to find the people who'll help you climb.